We're going to get straight to it. Let's talk to NBC News senior Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley, NBC News White House correspondent Vaughn Hilliard, and former Manhattan District Attorney Catherine Christian. Julia, I want to start with you because a lot of the questions there, especially towards the end, were about that Maryland father who was deported to El Salvador. The thing that stood out to me is kind of this game of pass the buck they seem to be playing there in the Oval Office. The president was asked about it. He deferred to Attorney General Pam Bondi, who said something else. And then the El Salvadoran president was asked about it, and he said, basically, I don't have the power to make the U.S. take back someone they don't want to take. What did stand out to you?
Yeah. Completely passing the buck here. That's right, because what he said is he can't smuggle someone back into the United States. It would only be smuggling, of course, if the U.S. wasn't welcoming him back. But, of course, the Supreme Court just said last week that they need to facilitate his return. The way most people interpreted that order was that they needed to go to El Salvador to talk to them and see if they would release him. Now, if for some reason El Salvador said no, the Supreme Court drew a line at effectuating his return. In other words, they can't send in the military. That might be going too far for a judge to order that. But facilitating would certainly mean opening our borders and allowing him to come in legally to be returned to his family, since he did have legal status to begin with. Another thing we've heard a lot from the Trump administration today is that his legal status that he got in 2019 through an immigration judge was a moot point because he was an MS-13 member. But we've never seen any evidence presented in court that connected him to MS-13 or to committing any kind of violent crime. So there's a lot of workarounds here. Another thing we're hearing them bring up more today, we heard this both from Stephen Miller and from Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, is that he's from El Salvador. And so the country of El Salvador can do whatever they want with him. But that's not really what Bukele was saying. He wasn't saying, wow, this is someone we really want back in our country. We've been looking for him. He's committed all of these crimes. Instead, he said, well, who am I to go against the United States? Meanwhile, the United States is saying, who are we to go against the wishes of El Salvador? A lot of passing the buck back and forth. Of course, we'll try to get to the bottom of this in a hearing that's scheduled for tomorrow in Maryland court. And then, of course, Christine, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more, but talking about building 5 more prisons potentially for U.S. citizens to be taken to El Salvador. I mean, it's a wonder that everyone in that room could remain so calm, because that is such a striking thing for Trump to say.
And Catherine, that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about. The president was asked if these deportations could potentially include U.S. citizens. And he said, we don't know. We're looking at the law. But if someone does really bad things, he mentioned, a few specific, very violent crimes, maybe, yes, that's something we're looking into. Is that legally possible? Where does this go?
Well, it's not legal. I'm not going to say it's not possible, because if you have a willing government and the United States government decides to not follow the law, it could happen. But you cannot deport a non-citizen. You're a citizen. You cannot deport a citizen. You're a citizen. Even non-citizens, as the Supreme Court said just last week, are entitled to due process before you deport them. So, no, it's not legal for a United States citizen to be deported because they committed a crime, convicted of a crime. But unfortunately, that they are saying, the government, saying that they're looking into that possibility is quite frankly frightening.
And Julia, I want to go back to you just a sec and talk again about this case of this Maryland man, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, because as you mentioned, the U.S. has been directed by the Supreme Court to, quote, facilitate. That's the word they're using. They say they can't necessarily order it, but to facilitate his return to the U.S. But you heard Marco Rubio say, sitting on that gold sofa there to the right of that shot, that the courts cannot dictate U.S. foreign policy. Basically, what we've heard from this administration, the courts can't tell the U.S. what to do when it comes to dealing with other countries. So where does this go from here if the court has said facilitate and the administration has said no?
Well, we'll see tomorrow at 4 o'clock when this is due to be back in court in Maryland. The Justice Department, representing the Trump administration in this case just last week, really refused to give over any information. There were 3 simple questions the judge asked, including, what plans they had to bring him back, anything that they had done already in order to facilitate his return, and where is he? And Ensign said he could not give that information to the judge. And so we'll see tomorrow if they've come to a place where they can at least give some basic answers, because as we've seen both from Judge Zenas in Maryland and from Judge Boasberg, who was overseeing the initial case that started as soon as the first 250 men were sent to El Salvador, is that the Justice Department by way of the Trump administration, is refusing to give a lot of basic information, which just moves the timeline on whether or not they are actually in contempt of court for refusing to follow these orders. Now, we should point out the Supreme Court, although they said they needed to facilitate his return, although they lifted temporarily the stay on the Trump administration using the Alien Enemies Act, which is why they were just able to send more people to El Salvador. The Supreme Court has still not weighed in on whether or not the Trump administration can invoke the Alien Enemies Act during peacetime. That really seems to be at the heart of this matter, and we still don't have an answer to that and exactly how the Justice Department, the Trump administration, will respond when courts continue to put a fine point on the fact that they do have control over people after they are in El Salvador. If you have such a close relationship that President Bukele is sitting there shoulder to shoulder with Trump today, then it begs the question, why can't there be an order to bring people back?
All right, Julia Ainsley, thank you so much. Vaughn, I want to turn to you now and ask you what stood out. To me, the other thing that was interesting is how enthusiastic the El Salvadoran president seemed to be about, frankly, the opportunity to take more individuals from the U.S. You know, he said, quote, "We're very eager and happy to help." He talked about crime. He talked about terrorism. He talked about the impact mass arrests have had in his country on the crime rate. What stood out to you?
Right. To Julia's point, the United States, the Trump administration, has a foreign partner in President Bukele. There was no direct request made inside of the Oval Office in the last hour from President Trump or his administration to President Bukele to return the Maryland father to the United States as directed by the U.S. Supreme Court. Instead, you heard Stephen Miller, the Deputy Chief of Staff, say it would be, quote, arrogant to expect that El Salvador would listen to the demands of the United States, that he has sovereign rule over his own country in what happens within it, including within this mega prison capacity. And I think that there's the financial arrangement to all of this that cannot be ignored. The U.S. providing El Salvador an initial $6 million to house these first several hundred individuals here. And for the United States, where does this go from here, I think is a compelling question, because effectively you have a White House that feels it is not in a position, or making the case it's not in a position, to be compelled by the judicial branch of the United States government to take action. And instead, what you are looking at is that they have partnered with President Bukele, somebody who has self-considered himself to be the, quote, coolest dictator in the world. Somebody who 1 year ago, the day after then candidate Trump was found guilty on 34 felony counts of business fraud, his own son, Don Jr., Matt Gaetz, Mike Lee, the senator out of Utah, they were not in New York when then candidate Trump was addressing the media about his guilty convictions. Instead, they were at the inauguration of President Bukele. This is a long-standing relationship between these two men, and a place where the one other note I'd make, Christina, is that before American cameras were allowed to video President Trump and President Bukele in the White House, President Bukele's social media team was live streaming parts of a conversation that the two men were having inside the corridors of the White House. And again, without American media cameras running, President Trump made a reference to those El Salvador videos that were put out of those deportees that were being led off of the aircraft into the mega prison, hunched over, hands shackled behind their backs. And the quote from the president of the United States was that people eat it up. That's what people want to see. Of course, that is not the typical way that prisoners are treated in the United States, but one that clearly has caught the eye and the glory of the president on how El Salvador treats prisoners.
And Catherine, what the Supreme Court says it wants to see is someone facilitating Abrego Garcia's return. The other thing that stood out to me, and I want to ask you about, is Pam Bondi, when asked about this question, kept focusing on this allegation that Abrego Garcia is or was a member of MS-13, this gang. And my question is, if that is the case, why hasn't that evidence been presented in court? Because that's something the court has cited over and over again, as the government seems to have no proof this individual committed any crimes and has itself said it was a clerical error.
They're trying, the government, to divert the attention from the court. The district court said she wants to know the steps the government is taking to facilitate Mr. Garcia's release, what steps that they plan to take, and his location. And she requested that every day by 5 o'clock until she says enough. Saturday, they just said he's alive and he's in the custody of El Salvador. Yesterday, they did exactly what Pam Bondi did today, just reminding the court that he's a member of MS-13 and he is in a terrorist organization. So the problem Mr. Garcia has, and I can envision the government doing this, is that the El Salvador president said, unless I misheard him, he was asked a direct question, not by President Trump or members of his administration, by a reporter, do you plan to return Mr. Garcia? And he said, of course, I'm not going to do it. So the government, our government, is going to say, Your Honor, Supreme Court, you had the answer from the El Salvadoran president. He's not going to do it. But as Vaughn accurately said, no one in the administration directly asked him or said, could you please do this? We want to facilitate him coming back. So there, the government, our government is going to say, El Salvador refuses to do it. That's the problem that Mr. Garcia has.